I'm seeing a through line we're going to get into in a minute here.
Absolutely. There is a through line. As you just said, the seed was planted early in many different kinds of seeds.
I didn't realize how literal that was.
Yes, exactly.
This is the Drive-By History Podcast. Welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, Ken Magos. On today's episode, I'll be joined by Kean University professor, Dr. Elizabeth Hyde. Let's get to it. So Beth, I'm so happy you were able to join us today. I get a chance to talk to you and learn a little bit more about your education, projects you're working on, things like that. So walk us through. I'm always curious about people who become historians. When did you realize you had such a deep interest in history?
For me, that interest goes all the way back to when I was a little girl.
Yeah.
I loved National Geographic magazine, and especially anything having to do with archaeology and ancient Egypt and Pompeii and so forth. But I also read a lot of historical fiction and semi-autobiographical works like the Little House on the Prairie series, that for me resonated a little bit differently, I think, because I grew up on a farm. And so I think I was able to connect parts of how I lived to things that were comparable to the experiences of those, living on the frontier. We would end up labeling as the pioneers who settled west of the Appalachians, but understanding too how things had evolved and changed. And so I think I read all of those books with a slightly different eye from a lot of the readers, and maybe that sparked in me some interest in bringing some critical analysis to the way people lived. Actually, I think so.
Well, it sounds like that seed was planted at a pretty young age. Then
the seed was planted at a young age. Yes.
Yeah. Were your parents interested in history? Was your family? Was this something you guys discussed?
Interested, not professionally interested, but interested, and they certainly encouraged my own curiosity.
So tell us about growing up on a farm. I'm really curious. I had an aunt and uncle who had a farm that I used to visit in the summers.
Yeah, absolutely. I grew up on a farm in West Virginia, not a huge farm, beef, cattle, sheep, a lot of the summertime spent working in the hayfield, that kind of thing. And then my parents also had a greenhouse, a pretty extensive family greenhouse business where we grew bedding plants and vegetable plants for both a retail and a wholesale market. So
I'm seeing a through line we're going to get into in a minute here.
Absolutely. There is a through line. As you just said, the seed was planted early in many different kinds of seeds.
I didn't realize how literal that was.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
No, that's fascinating. So yeah. I know that, you specialize in European history, but a particular aspect of it.
Absolutely. So as I mentioned to you earlier, I was, sort of interested in how people's, change over time and how people's lives and lifestyles and culture changes over time. And so I was particularly interested in the period of the 16th, 17th, 18th century, where you really see the emergence of the modern world, the not entirely complete collapse of a more superstitious, magical way of thinking about how the world functioned. And then with the arrival of the scientific revolution, and of course, the age of exploration, a very different idea about how the world worked and the ability of human beings to control that world. So I became very interested as a college student in that early modern period. And of course, Western Europe was the area where you see this emerging. It's that transformation that's going to shape the early history of the United States as well.
Sure.
Yeah. And but I was always very interested in art as well. And so developed an interest in art history. I had done a minor in art history. And when I got to graduate school, was really coming to understand from a professional perspective how these interests came together, I realized I was a cultural historian, right? I was an historian who was interested in a broad range of sources and the material aspects of life in this time period. And from that, I became interested in the use of flowers in portraiture in that period, flowers that are more frequently used to ornament portraits of women in the time period, but also sometimes men. And so I was exploring this as my likely dissertation topic as a graduate student. And the more I got into my work, in conversation with my thesis advisor, I said, you know what? I don't think we fully understand how flowers functioned in society at this moment. What did flowers mean in the 17th century? Why was it so important that the flowers were included there? There are very old, of course, connections between women and fertility and flowers and beauty. So in that sense, it made perfect sense. But they're far too prevalent in this time period for that to be the only answer. And of course, by the time you get to the 17th century, you begin to see very specific kinds of flowers included in painting of the era in Baroque art. And I said, I think my real project here is to do a cultural history of flowers at this particular moment.
So what did you discover? I'm curious. Yeah, can you give us some insight?
Absolutely. So the area of 17th century culture, floriculture, that's most frequently examined is the Tulip Mania of the Netherlands, when in the first decades of the 17th century, people began to cultivate the tulip, which had arrived from Turkey into Western Europe in the last decades of the 16th century. The tulip showed a tendency to variegate rather easily. And so people began selectively breeding them to produce different colors. They didn't know at the time that the most wildly striped versions, the red and white striped versions, were caused by a virus. But I
didn't know that either.
Yeah, absolutely. And that created all kinds of problems, because that meant that they were very irregularly variegating, and you couldn't predict what bulb was going to produce that. And that became a serious financial problem, because the desire for these tulips was so great that, of course, the wealthy and the fashionable, the cultural elites wanted to have them. Gardens, formal gardens, had become a sign of stature, of cultural accomplishment. And in the 17th century, that meant having the right kinds of flowers.
I want to go back for a second, though, before we go on. You talked about tulips coming from Turkey.
Yeah.
We associate them, I think, generally with Holland.
Yes. And that is where they were first commercially produced.
Okay.
So the bulbs themselves are believed to have originated in Turkey, and the first bulbs were landed in the hands of a botanist, Clusius, who I believe was at Leiden at the university there, had a botanical garden there, and their early history is associated with him.
Okay.
But it is in the Netherlands where you begin to see, but it spreads very rapidly. It's a culture that's shared in Italy. It's shared in England, though a little bit later, and it's shared especially in France, where my own research ended up being focused. And that was that these wealthy elites, these cultural elites, wanted to have those tulips in their gardens. The demand for them became so great in the first decades of the 17th century that people were actually trading in tulip bulbs. And they had that much value? They had that much value. There was a dramatic inflation of the value of tulip bulbs, which then dramatically crashed. And so the tulip ended up becoming then a symbol of the ephemerality of this new capitalistic economy. But what my own research found was that the interest in these flowers, in these elite flowers, went beyond the tulip. So in the same period that people were collecting tulips, they were also collecting anemones, narcissus, irises, ranunculi, were auriculas. Those were the most important. Carnations. These were called florist flowers, and they were the flowers that were cultivated by people who came to be defined. And this is a term that even ends up in one of the most important 17th century French dictionaries, curious florists. So it was a type. It was an identity. It was a cultural identity, and it was largely male, because it was men who had the geopolitical connections and the money to acquire them. And as they were selectively breeding, as they were interacting with botanists who were also studying and producing new varieties of plants, it was identified as well. It was connected to science, to the world of science. So it implied cultural sophistication, intellectual sophistication, and wealth.
That makes sense.
Exactly. So then you have these networks of men who were literally flower collectors. And then you find, very importantly, the adoption of that whole language of floral cultural sophistication into the political realm, because, of course, in this era, you have within France, for example, where you have a feudal nobility and of course an absolute monarchy becoming ever stronger with Louis XIII and then Louis XIV in the 17th century. They, of course, have to have flowers as well. And Louis XIV understood that one of the most important ways that he could express his power over French society was to assert his power over French culture. And he gathered the resources to, of course, build the largest, most magnificent garden in Europe at the time at Versailles. And the gardeners, in fact, then put in place a whole network of systems, nursery gardens in the south of France that would furnish bulbs. What they figured out how to do, and very important and not surprising sort of mercantilistic economic approach, was to, in the south, from a naval base on the Mediterranean in the south of France, send people out to buy immature and therefore much cheaper bulbs from Mediterranean sources, raise them to maturity in the south of France, and then ship them north to be planted at Versailles and other royal palaces.
Wow.
Yes, it's absolutely.
I'm just imagining a visitor to Versailles at the time probably is seeing some flowers they've never heard of or never seen before.
Absolutely. Unique flowers, extensive numbers of flowers. They developed a bedding out system at Versailles where they would raise flowers to blossom in the orangeries and the conservatories, what the predecessors to greenhouses as we would understand them today, raise them until they started to flower, and then just plop them pot and all into the soil, into a particular parterre or part of the garden overnight, so that it appeared as though they had appeared magically. And that was the intent. It was the argument that Louis XIV controlled nature. We think of it in allegorical or metaphorical terms. The king is so powerful that he can harness nature. He can make water, spout out of the fountains. He can make, his vegetable gardener could produce peas and other vegetables in the off season, and they could have all of these flowers magically appear in the garden. They even had one garden at the Trianon part of Versailles that was almost exclusively planted in fragrant flowers. So hyacinths, jasmines, and tuberoses, where you're to be overwhelmed by the perfume of them. And there was a pavilion in the garden where the elites who were invited to the Trianon Palace would go and enjoy that fragrance. But they report having been driven inside at times because the fragrance was so strong. So it was this sensory demonstration of the power of the king. But from another angle, it's not just about art and iconography. The rather really important thing about the late 16th century all the way through into the middle of the 19th century is that Europe, and indeed the much of the world, was experiencing what we now refer to as a little ice age.
Mm-hmm.
And so the average temperatures slightly declined. The climate conditions became highly unpredictable. So there were late frosts and early frosts, really dry summers, really wet summers.
Mm-hmm.
And that was wreaking havoc with the ability for countries, even France, which is one of the most prosperous in Western Europe, to ensure a steady supply of food for the French people.
Right.
So even though, it's Louis XIV saying, I have power over nature, that power over nature was no trivial thing when you're actually struggling to feed people and you have people rioting in the streets when there's not enough grain. The Bourbon monarchy, and Louis XIV in particular, was far more effective in producing these allegorical demonstrations of power in the gardens than they were in actually impacting agricultural productivity and actually solving the problem of supply for people. And those problems and challenges continued right up to the end of the 18th century. And of course, the food supply and the price of bread was a major factor leading to the French Revolution and the eventual overthrow of the Bourbon monarchy. So it's all, it's really central to the communication of political power. It's really central to the maintenance of political power.
So I'm imagining that a lot of these plants would only be available to the elite. When did they become available to common folks? When could you and I go and buy these?
Yeah. So
not that I'm calling us common folks, but we're not.
Yeah. Exactly. So there was a very long history of selling bouquets of flowers, often wildflowers, or more commonly available violets, roses, and things. That goes all the way back to antiquity. Women, usually underprotected women, often those who had to resort to prostitution or who were begging in the streets, would sell bouquets of flowers as a charitable, to seek, as they were essentially begging for financial support. So that tradition is very, very old. The use of flower bouquets as an offering in the church is very, very old. So ornamental flowers to decorate our lives is something that really, goes very, very far back in human history and in European culture. You really have the development of the first big commercial nurseries for plants in the 17th century. The Dutch
that early, okay.
That early. The Dutch are going to be the most successful, but it will spread around Western Europe. By the time you get to the first half of the 19th century, it becomes, if we want to put it in these terms, more democratized. And so you begin to have the production of gardening manuals that were cheaper books that ordinary people might be able to afford. So, and then by the time you get to the end of the 19th century, you have, it becomes a working class tradition, flower growing contests in England, for example, becomes a deeply ingrained working class kind. So the gendering and the class pieces are just really, really fascinating.
Yeah, it's an interesting aspect to it, right? Very much
absolutely.
So. I while you were talking, I was immediately thinking of the Covent Garden flower seller idea, that trope that we have, and as a way of making money, trying to sell. I'm curious though, do the flowers themselves have any specific meaning? We think of, if I give you a red rose, it symbolizes love. Yes,
there was a very intricate language of flowers that becomes highly elaborate in the Middle Ages. There's both religious symbolism to the rose and the lily in particular. The lily often represent the purity of Mary within the Christian tradition. And then you have in the medieval chivalric tradition, the rose for love and various meanings for different flowers that gets revived in the beginning of the 19th century. The whole language of flowers becomes really intricate. And it's interesting that emerges at the same time that Linnaeus and his classification of plants, which is based on the sexuality, the sexual reproduction of plants. So yet again, you have some play at the gendering of plants and the study of plants.
Right.
You do have, by the time you get to the late 18th century, the perception that women could study botany, not professionally, but they could. That was an intellectual pursuit that was suitable for women. Even Rousseau, who was an incredible misogynist but an enthusiastic botanist, said that women could study botany.
Wow, how generous.
Yes, exactly.
And then you've got someone like Elizabeth Coleman White, who comes along and helps standardize the blueberry and the cranberry.
Absolutely. And women were, even though they were, largely excluded from the academy and the formal scientific study of plants, there are important women connected to floriculture professionally in different ways. So
I think you're right too. I don't think she was professionally trained. I don't know that she had a degree in botany.
Yeah. I don't think so, but I don't know.
We did that episode a couple of years ago, and it's like in the back of my mind.
I saw it, and it was wonderful. But I don't remember. I don't know her, her training either. But flower painting, back to the interest in flowers.
Sure.
Flower painting was acceptable for women because that meant they could develop their artistic talents in painting something that was commercially and aesthetically valuable, but it didn't require the study of the human nude, which meant that women wouldn't have to be formally trained in the artistic academies where their presence would have been unacceptable.
I didn't think of that, but you're right. Yeah, they probably couldn't have.
Yeah, that's a part of it. And so some of the first women who were admitted to the French Academy of painting are flower painters.
Wow. And I know in our own area here, as an aside, we did an episode on Madison, which is known as Rose City.
Yes.
Because it was a hotbed for development of a lot of different varieties of roses that were then spread throughout the world.
Yeah. And roses. So one of the most important patrons of the culture of roses is, of course, Josephine, Empress under Napoleon. And she, her rose collection at Malmaison and other palaces in France was unsurpassed. And she was the patron of Redoute, who was the painter of most of the images, the painted images of roses that have become iconic in Western rose culture.
Wow, I love that you studied this so much. It's such a fascinating history, and there's so much depth to it.
There is. It has been a wonderful area to work on, and it, as you've suggested, brings us over to this side of the Atlantic in some really important ways. And what I found once I ended up in New Jersey and teaching here at Kean University and began to explore William Livingston, was looking at some of his papers and found a letter to him from the French consul in New York, Louis Guillaume Otto, essentially asking Livingston for permission for the French to purchase a piece of land in present-day Hoboken.
Oh, wow.
And to serve as a nursery, to serve as a garden. And I started following the threads of that document, and I realized that this was connected to a set of documents that I had noted existed many years earlier when I was in Paris doing my dissertation research on floriculture, a whole collection of documents related to American nurseries, the Pépinière d'Amérique. So, and I noted it. I said, I've got to get back to this because I'm fascinated, but had to move on with the dissertation. I went back to those documents,
Mm-hmm.
and what emerges out of that story is a good part of the 18th century relationship between plants, their cultural, economic, political, geopolitical value, and the French monarchy again, sitting right here in my backyard, essentially, at Kean. And what those documents revealed were an 18th century attempt on the part of the French monarchy to gather knowledge, but especially specimens of North American plants, but especially trees that could be acclimatized in France.
Interesting.
Yes. And it's part of the colonial project, which, everybody in Western Europe was looking for the next sugarcane, the next tobacco, what cotton would become, these cash crops that stood to transform the economy, transform the geopolitical power of these countries, and even play for the French perspective, a military role. So the French had botanists who were doing some prospecting and collecting of plants as early as the French were exploring North America, and especially as they were in the Mississippi River Valley and in Quebec and so forth. They had some haphazard gathering of specimens, but their interest accelerated in the 1770s and 80s. The French, of course, had been defeated by the British in the 7 Years' War, that war concluding in 1763. They were defeated in large part because they did not have a navy that could compete with the British Navy, and therefore couldn't support their troops and sustain a war on this side of the Atlantic. And of course, at this point, all of these ships are wooden. All of these ships require extensive lumber supplies. They require masts that were a specific sort of type of tree. So they're always looking for pines that are going to make masts and oak that is going to build ships. And the British had very successfully exploited North American resources in the 13 colonies, especially in New England, in order to supplement the lumber that they needed for their navy. And the French, when the Americans began to seek independence, when the American Revolution broke out, the French saw an opportunity as the divide deepened between the American colonists and the British to jump into North America and see if they could therefore exploit those resources that the British now were going to lose control over.
Yep.
So, yes. And so that is exactly what began to happen in the late 1770s and into the 1780s.
Wow.
Yes, it's an amazing story, and they basically charged their diplomatic corps with gathering plants. And they attempted to do so. Crevecoeur of Letters of American Farmer fame was gathering samples of woods, different kinds of lumber that was extracted from different trees. He sent that back to France. They gathered seeds and live specimens. Louis Guillaume Otto in New York was doing the same. The Marquis de Marbois in Philadelphia was doing the same. And finally, they decided that they needed to escalate the project and actually send a botanist. And so it was at that point in 1785 that Louis XVI sent French botanist André Michaud from France to North America to do this on a professional level, essentially, to gather trees that could be sent back. And so he arrived in December of 1785 in New York, and decided that the way he would conduct his research would be to take expeditions into the countryside, into the wilderness. He goes as far north as the Hudson Bay. He goes as far south into Florida and into the Bahamas. But he needed nursery gardens where he could bring the specimens that he found and allow them to grow temporarily in those nursery gardens, but also to begin to reproduce them.
Right.
Exactly. And so in 1786, he reached out to Governor William Livingston.
There's the connection.
There is the connection.
Yeah.
And he is the botanist that was going to build a garden on this plot of land that he eventually was granted. There's a wonderful, wonderful letter from Livingston where the French are asking to allow him to buy this land. And Livingston, of course, we've gone through the American Revolution, Livingston became, a firmly committed patriot and an essential part of the American success in the American Revolution. Committed constitutionalist, wrote back to the French and said that he was a governor and not a king. And therefore, he could not simply waive the rules that prohibited a Frenchman from buying land in New Jersey, but he could recommend that the state assembly take up the cause and pass an edict allowing Michaud to make this purchase. And so that is
wow, that's fascinating. I have a question for you though in all of this, because I know in a past episode of Drive by History we talked about the natural landscape.
Yes.
What was here before a lot of the colonists brought over cuttings of plants, vegetables, things like that?
Yes.
So a lot of what we take for granted as being American, like apples and waves of grain, and not really North American.
Exactly.
If we go to Western Europe now, are we seeing a sampling of plants that would have been indigenous to North America?
We are seeing some of those plants. Absolutely. And there are two key components to this. One is that taste in gardening, the aesthetic of gardens began to change in the 18th century. And it occurs first in England, where you see a rejection of the formal, highly clipped, highly geometrical symmetry that you see at Versailles in favor of something that looked more natural, even though it was a highly complicated.
It was anything but.
It was anything but natural, but it appeared more natural. And you would walk through winding pathways through a landscape that had untrimmed trees, but trees that are planted specifically in order to create a certain vista or a picturesque view that you were to take in. And because now, while there are follies and fountains and structures within those gardens, there was a greater importance on the vegetation to contribute to that sense of the natural.
Gotcha.
So they became interested in trees and shrubs and flowering shrubs that could introduce different textures and different colors and different shapes into the garden. And it was American trees and shrubs and flowering shrubs that became the most fashionable for introducing that diversity, that arboreal diversity. Absolutely. And the Americans got this. And so most famously, the Bartrams in Philadelphia. So Bartram's Garden in Philadelphia is one of the most important early botanical gardens and commercial nurseries in the Americas. And the Bartrams very successfully marketed their commercial resources in England. And so you could be in England or in France and you could buy what was called a Bartram's box, which was a box that had a selection of seeds that would produce the look that you were supposed to have in your 18th century garden.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yes. And so you absolutely have American specimens shaping what would become the English style landscape garden in the 18th and into the 19th centuries. And Bartram had then a cousin, I believe, he's related, Humphrey Marshall, who produced a book, a catalog of American trees that could be successfully grown in Europe. And this was a commercial operation.
Wow. So where are we today as far as gardening goes? I mean, it seems like depending on driving around my neighborhood, I live in New Jersey. So obviously, we are the garden state. Things do tend to grow well here.
Yes.
Where are we on that continuum? Are we still using a lot of the same plantings, or is it something new?
So there are all kinds of things happening that have been
it's pretty much everything is happening.
Everything is happening. It's been enabled by the evolution of botany and commercial nurseries, the commercial production of seeds and hybrid varieties of all of these different plants that, as we know, from our consumption of produce, has a broad range of effects on the end result. So we can have tomatoes and strawberries year round because we can now import them from the far corners of the world at any time that we want. But in order for them to survive that transportation, they've been bred in ways that result in a perfect aesthetic look and sturdiness that allows them to be shipped around. Sometimes that has meant loss of fragrance or loss of flavor, and so changes take place that impact in some important ways. Now, hybrids, disease-resistant plants mean we're going to be more successful in growing things.
True. I'm sure there's a trade-off no matter how you...
Exactly. But we still see waxing and waning of fashion in flowers or in plantings in the yard. One year, impatiens will be in. The next year, no impatiens. And we're back to good old geraniums. So fashion continues to play a key role. I know from growing up in family in the business, right, that the gendering continues to be fascinating. We send bouquets of flowers that are messages of love, for example, or appreciation or thank you. But you have within families this, who's in charge of the flower gardens, who grows the vegetables, in ways that plays out really, really interestingly.
That's fascinating to me, though. So another aspect to your scholarship also is women's studies. And I think since you're talking so much about gender roles, I think it's an interesting time to dip into that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the interest in flowers really came in part out of this interest in the representation of women in the early modern period. And the flower connection is key here because of the relationship between women and women's bodies and fertility and flowers was regarded as unruly. The relationship between women selling flowers and women selling sex, the equation of the two in the streets, was regarded as dangerous. And another piece, or culturally suspect, right? And then another piece of it is the fact that knowledge of herbal healing was, prior to the professionalization of medicine, the realm primarily of women. And
bordered on witchcraft almost, didn't it?
Exactly. Yes. And many of the women in this same period that I'm interested in studying, right, the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, when the witch craze erupted in Western Europe and then in colonial America, very often women who were suspected of being witches were also women who had a reputation in their community as being a healer because they had knowledge of herbs and herbal medicine and herbal healing. It's a fascinating time period because you see that the knowledge of herbs and the use of herbs sort of straddling what at the time was an intricate and completely intertwined understanding of the ability of these herbs to have an impact, a medical impact. Today, we would look at what they did and we would sort of separate out the physical impact of an herb, what happens to the body when you ingest it, from the ritualized uses of those herbs, or the ritualized
you mean the incantation doesn't
the
have
incantations, for example, exactly. And today, we separate the magic from the science.
Exactly.
But in the early 17th century, it was entirely inseparable. And so you have women and flowers being regarded, the connections between the two of them are it's beauty, but it's sexuality, and therefore temptation, and
a little dangerous.
Exactly. Yeah. At the same time that men are saying, but we're cultivating the rarest blossoms, and they're going around and visiting each other's flower collections, and asserting something very different about themselves,
right?
Through their cultural consumption of flowers. So it's absolutely fascinating. But yes, it is related to one of the most horrible events in the early modern period, and that is the witch trials. And
which we covered. You and I we talked about that out in the Hamptons.
Yes, for one of the earliest.
Yeah, that predated Salem, if I remember correctly.
It did predate Salem, and Salem is interesting because it's very late in the history of the witch trials. By the time the witch trials break out in Salem, they were the craze or the mania or the terror of the witch trials had almost completely ended in Western Europe.
Okay.
So the colonies were always a little bit behind in what was happening.
Yeah.
But it's very much the witch trials and the focus on the fear that these women might, either through their use of herbs or their knowledge of the devil, might harness the powers of the devil to cause bad things to happen, is of course rooted in the same anxieties that led Louis XIV to say, I control nature in his garden, because the climate was incredibly unpredictable at this time. Crops were enough grain to get through the winter was not guaranteed, and levels of anxiety ran extremely, extremely high.
Well, that makes sense. Also, I mean, you talked about separating the magic from the science.
Yes.
The magic, the incantation that goes along with those herbs, but also the lack of knowledge of the science of what those herbs are going to do.
Yes.
I'm sure a lot of people got sick. Some people probably died.
Yes.
Yeah. So of course, yeah. And who are you going to blame?
Who are you going to blame? Exactly. And when you can't control the outcomes because the medical capabilities were so rudimentary, then the desire to find a cause or lay blame for the bad outcome.
Right. And you're still a century or two away from really understanding the biology of the body.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
No, that makes sense. Okay. So tell us what projects you're working on. What's coming up for you?
So what's coming up for me is continued work on the botanical mission of André Michaux.
Yep.
André Michaud's was just in the archives in Paris, looking at some of the documents that he sent back to his bosses in France as he was gathering plants, including a wonderful map that he sent to them showing where in present-day Hoboken he had purchased his land to make his garden, explaining that situated right between New Jersey and New York, but within that Meadowlands area, he was able to have easy access by water to Manhattan, where he could ship these plants back. Is just a wonderful document. So I'm continuing to work on his papers, and I'm doing some network analysis, essentially looking at the plants that he brought from France or were sent to him by his bosses in France to the United States, that he planted either in his garden in Hoboken or the much larger operation that he established in Charleston, South Carolina, looking at those plants and looking at how the those elite landowners and gardeners on this side of the Atlantic were incorporating European plants or global plants, because some of the specimens that Michaud brought from France were originally from China. So you really see a global network coming into existence. And then you see the desire for American plants that Michaud is feeding into elite French gardens of the 18th century. And so in 1792, in the Revolution, many of the French nobility who had been the purchasers of American plants, the collectors of American plants, of course, fled because their lives were at stake.
They were at risk, yeah.
Yes, exactly. And many of them, of course, would go to the guillotine. The French government, and this continued into the Republican government, is one of the more successful attempts to take a royal institution and nationalize it.
Okay.
And that was to take the royal nursery, the Jardin des Plantes in Paris, and transform it into what would become a national botanical garden. In the wake of the French Revolution, as the nobility fled, the government actually confiscated plants from the gardens of the nobility and took them to the Jardin des Plantes and into nurseries that then they established at Versailles once they had essentially kicked the royal family.
Wow, but they're creating a repository for all of these.
Exactly. And in these records, so I've been exploring the records of the confiscations, and they repeatedly distinguish, as they're listing all of these different species of flowers and flowering shrubs and trees, they're distinguishing what came from America. They are still trying to grasp, or hold on to, collect, cultivate what they thought was this American botanical richness, and incorporate it into their collection. So I'm working on that, and I'm continuing to work on William Livingston as an example of the American archetype. He, like Thomas Jefferson, like George Washington, was an enthusiastic gardener. And at Liberty Hall, the very first thing he did before he built the home on his estate, Liberty Hall, was to start working on the gardens. And so he hired some local workers, and also he hired members of the Crane family in Elizabethtown to plant apple trees, dozens of apple trees. This was the first thing that you did to improve your garden. To improve the piece of land, you had to have an orchard. Drinking cider was, of course, incredibly important.
Well, I was going to say there was a sideline to this. Yeah,
exactly. But in addition to those apple trees, he does some intentional gathering of elite versions of the orchard. And that is, it's a wonderful letter from the late 1760s, before the house was built at Liberty Hall, where he had a friend who was studying in London, and he asked this friend to go to the nursery of Gordon and Dermer and Thompson. It was one of the most important nurseries in London in the late 18th century. They produced catalogs. Livingston must have been in possession of one of their catalogs. And he basically asked for an order that includes over, and I'm blanking on the numbers, but 20, 30, 40 different pears and plums.
Wow. Okay. Any particular reason pears and plums?
They were among the most fashionable fruits of the late 18th century. So he was creating a garden an orchard at Versailles at Liberty Hall.
I was going to say,
yes, that would have had those elite fruit trees growing in them.
Wow. And do any of these specimens still exist?
So none of the fruit trees still exist.
Okay.
The oldest fruit tree is a pear tree that dates to probably the 1820s or 30s.
Okay.
But
Do
we
they just
don't-
not live that long? Is that the issue?
Yeah, they
Okay.
don't live that long. But what we do have is a different kind of tree growing in the front of Liberty Hall. So at the end of the letter where William Livingston requested all of these pears and plums, the varieties, the named varieties that he wanted, presumably listed right out of the catalog, at the very bottom of the letter, he said, and please have the nurseryman add 2 quarts of horse chestnut seeds. Yes, the horse chestnut tree.
I was just going to say.
Yes, exactly. Was not native to North America. It was not native to Western Europe. It also was a specimen from probably the Asia Minor region. But in the 17th century, the horse chestnut had become very popular as a tree that could be successfully used in formal gardens. John Evelyn wrote about them in England, explained that they were suitable for planting along grand alleys in these formal gardens. And so they became extremely popular in Western Europe. And then the colonists, of course, in North America were interested in importing the finest things from Europe.
Of course.
It thought that Peter Collinson was probably the origin of one of the first documented horse chestnut coming into the Philadelphia region, which would have been a couple of decades earlier than William Livingston's 1769 letter buying 2 quarts of horse chestnut seeds. But there is living right outside of the of what's now the front door of Liberty Hall, a horse chestnut tree. Family lore says that tree was planted in 1772 by his daughters.
Wow.
So we have a living specimen of an American gardener's desire to create a formal garden
I love
America, for which he acquired seeds from the most fashionable nursery in London.
Wow.
So
That's fascinating. And people can, I know Liberty Hall is open to the public.
Liberty Hall is open to the public, and the horse chestnut tree, it is thriving is a little bit strong. It's struggling in some ways. Some limbs have had to be cut off, and over the years, different attempts have been made to support the tree and ensure that
I think most people don't realize plants are not every plant is like a sequoia or redwood.
Exactly,
yeah, they don't all live for thousands of years.
Yes, and so efforts are being made to sustain it, of course, and efforts are being made to gather the horse chestnuts and reproduce them. And in fact, I'm not sure if the same is happening this year, but last year Liberty Hall was actually selling, in exchange for a donation to Liberty Hall, horse chestnut trees.
Wow.
In your own garden. Which
you can own a piece of history in your own garden.
You can own a piece of history. You can own a piece of the history of gardening in Western culture.
Wow, I love that. That's fascinating. I had no idea. I've been to Liberty Hall. I didn't realize that chestnut tree out front was important.
It's important. And it's one of the oldest documented trees in the state of New Jersey, but one that illustrates, it's a living example of the cultural role that many of the founders were trying to play. That William Livingston, a highly educated man, somebody of an elite family, the New York political dynasty, the Livingston family, owner of a wonderful library, the contents of which he carefully listed in a book list that our students have studied, also wanted to be a gardener like the elite men on the other side of the Atlantic. And his letters, just like Thomas Jefferson's letters and George Washington's letters, are filled with exchanges, whether it was with his son-in-law John Jay or others, about the vegetables growing in their gardens, the fruit trees, the sharing of specimens, the sharing of seeds, really is there's an entire sociability, social networks, cultural networks built up around the exchange of plants in this time period.
And documented for you to study.
And documented.
How fortunate are we?
Yes. Yes.
That's amazing. So where can people learn more about some of these projects that you're working on? Is there a website or something they can visit? I know everybody needs a website.
Everybody needs a website. And my website has sadly succumbed to the transition from old Google sites to new Google sites.
Yep.
My work has been published. So my book, Cultivated Power, Flowers, Culture, and Politics in the Reign of Louis XIV, is available, as are numerous articles that I've published on the mission of Andre Michaud.
Wonderful.
And hopefully soon a full volume on the mission of Andre Michaud that is titled From Monarchical Climates to Republican Soil. A wonderful phrase of William Livingston's that defines exactly what's at stake in floriculture, plant culture in the 18th century, looking at how monarchies are attempting to exploit knowledge of and resources, horticultural resources to support their goals, and how the new Republic of the United States is going to respond in kind.
I love that. Well, we will definitely look forward to that. Yeah, absolutely. That's exciting. So I'm curious, you've been with us on a couple episodes of Drive By History. I'm curious if you can speak to why a show like Drive By History is important.
Absolutely. Drive By History. And I've had such a wonderful time participating.
Oh, we loved having you on the show.
In this series. It is absolutely essential to feeding public knowledge of our past and helping the broader public understand that our history is all around us, that our history may be in the blueberries that we're buying at the grocery store, or our history is looking at our transportation system, or that people that we never thought of as being key to the shaping of our culture, whether we're thinking about New Jersey or the larger region, has been shaped by people and factors that go back decades and centuries. And as a professor of history, I look across the classroom, and I know that most of my students aren't going to go on to become professional historians. Many of them will go on to become social studies teachers. Some of them will be professors of history. But I want all of them, regardless of where they end up, to have an understanding that the ground they're walking on has a history. I want all of them to understand the importance of bringing their historical sensibilities to the other parts of the world that they consume, to the museums that they're going to go to, for example, and to have that broader context. And Drive By History gives people that by showing them parts of history or people in history that they may have driven by every day without giving them a second thought, and knowing that, in fact, no, this shapes the way you live your life today.
Yep. We try to ignite that spark, and through the participation of wonderful historians like you, we're able to provide an interpretation you can't find anywhere else. I am so grateful that people like you take part in our series. You bring such a fresh perspective to these things. I love it.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute delight to be involved with the series.
And we will see more of you in the future, I'm sure. Absolutely. So for our audience, you can find more information about our show at drivebyhistory.org. You can watch past episodes there. You can see the episodes we were talking about tonight. I hope that you all will join us for the next episode of the Drive By History podcast. Elizabeth, thank you so much for participating today. Really appreciate it.
It's been
wonderful.
Pleasure.
All right.